Hi, my friend. I just wanted to say I'm glad you're here. Today, I want to tell you the story of Mrs. Beatrice Langford, a 72-year-old widow living in a grand old mansion that once echoed with laughter, memories, and love. But one evening, everything changed. Her daughter-in-law slapped her across the face during dinner, and her only son just stood there, silent. That night, while everyone slept, Beatrice overheard a secret conversation downstairs, a plan to send her to a nursing home and take control of everything she owned. They thought she was weak. They thought she would break. But they were wrong. Instead of falling apart, she quietly turned the tables and made them face the price of their betrayal. So stay with me until the very end, because the ending of this story is living proof that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers and still echoes forever. The faint clinking of dishes from downstairs pulled me out of sleep. Soft morning light slipped through the curtains, touching the old oak cabinet Harold and I had once picked out in a tiny shop in Paris. The faint scent of lavender from the sachet in the drawer still lingered as if he were somehow still near. I turned to look at the clock on the bedside table, 7:30. Rosa always brought my tea at 8, never earlier. Pulling my robe tighter, I slid into my worn velvet slippers and held the railing as I went downstairs. My knees ached a little, but I was used to that. For 50 years, this house had seen everything: Christmas dinners, the sound of Harold's piano, and my son Daniel's laughter when he was a boy. But this morning, the sounds were different. They didn't belong to home. They belonged to strangers. When I stepped into the dining room, I heard Lila's voice. "Morning, Bee." She had never called me Mom, not even Mrs. Langford. Always just Bee, short, empty, and cold as if I were a guest in my own home. Daniel sat at the head of the table, reading the paper coffee steaming in front of him. "Good morning, dear," I said softly. He only nodded, eyes glued to the financial section. I glanced around the room, once my pride and joy, and something felt off. The porcelain crane and cherry blossom set Harold and I had brought from San Francisco was gone. In its place, a row of plain, soulless white plates, the kind you'd find in any supermarket. "Where's the porcelain set?" I asked quietly. Without looking at me, Lila said, "I put it away. It's too old. Doesn't go in the dishwasher. These new ones are easier." I tried to keep my tone calm. "You put them away without asking me first?" she smirked. "Obey. I'm just trying to make the house a little more modern." Daniel folded the paper and added, "Mom, Lila's just helping. Nobody hand washes dishes anymore." I bit my lip, holding back a sigh. For 15 years, Rosa had washed those dishes by hand and never once complained. I wanted to say it, but I couldn't. Maybe because I knew the moment I did, I'd hear something that would break me even more. Lila moved around the kitchen like she owned it, every gesture smooth and confident. And me, the woman who'd kept this home alive all her life, just stood there silent, like I no longer belonged. I thought of the old days when Harold hosted diplomats here, when music and laughter filled these walls. Now I sat at the side watching a young woman command the house with a voice sweet enough to sting. Sunlight bounced off those sterile plates, making them gleam blank pages with no story, no soul. Each piece of that old porcelain had a memory: a rainy day in San Francisco, Harold bargaining in his soft-toned dinner at a Chinatown restaurant after. Each use had kept his laughter alive. Now they sat buried in a dark cabinet, all in the name of practicality. Practical. Lila's favorite word. But to me, this house was never meant to be practical. It was built from memory, from love only those who truly cared could understand. I swallowed the hurt and started to leave, but her voice followed me. "Bea." I was thinking of redecorating the living room. That portrait of Harold feels outdated. I froze. "What did you say? I just think an abstract piece would brighten up the space. That old portrait is a little heavy." My chest tightened. That portrait, Harold in his gray suit, eyes kind yet firm, had hung there for half a century. I said nothing. If I spoke, I might cry. Later that afternoon, I walked into the study and found half the books gone. My favorite volumes, European art of the 19th century, the ones Harold used to tease me for loving more than jewelry, now dumped in the basement beside flour and coffee tins. Dust already settled on their spines. Behind me, Lila's syrupy voice broke the silence. I just wanted the room to feel more open. People like minimalism now. I turned. "Every book here has a story. You had no right to touch them." She smiled faintly. "Spaces need to breathe, Bea. The old must make room for the new." After she left, I sank into Harold's old leather chair. The familiar scent of tobacco and oak filled the room. My eyes stung. Had I really grown so old that even my son no longer heard his mother's voice? That night when Rosa brought my tea, she looked around nervously. "Mrs. Beatrice, do you know where Mr. Harold's portrait went? I can't find it anywhere." I knotted my throat tight. "She replaced it with a gray abstract painting." Rosa frowned. "That's not right. He belongs there." I touched her shoulder gently. "Don't worry, Rosa. I'll bring him back to his place. Just not yet." After she left, I walked to the glass room, my sanctuary. But the violets I'd tended for 20 years were gone. In their place, rows of succulents, stiff and lifeless, lined up like soldiers. I knelt and pressed my fingers into the soil, cold, dry, and empty. Rosa entered, basket of linens in hand. They replaced everything she whispered. Said violets were too hard to care for. I smiled sadly. Hard to care for doesn't mean not worth caring for. When night fell, I sat in the dark listening to the ticking clock. Each tick counted down the seconds I had left in my own home. I saw every change, the moved table, new curtains, strange voices in my kitchen. I understood now. Piece by piece, they were erasing me. But they'd forgotten one thing. I don't fade that easily. I've survived war loss and loneliness. And I know this every intrusion, no matter how small, is a warning. That night, standing at the staircase, the hallway light slicing through the dark, I looked around my house and I felt it. A storm was coming, and this time I would be the one steering it. If you've ever watched someone slowly pushed out of their own home, if you know that kind of pain, then hit like and comment 1 so I know you stand with Beatrice. Because when your voice is taken from your own house, the fight ahead isn't just for property, it's for the dignity of a mother. 2 days later, the house looked nothing like home. Flags, candles, crisp white linens, everything was perfectly arranged, as if Lila were staging a performance, not hosting a simple dinner. From the top of the stairs, I watched workers carrying in crates of white lilies, their sharp scent choking the air. My home, once warm with tea and oak wood, now felt like a hotel lobby. "Bea, you'll love this," Lila said, adjusting her earpiece while checking her guest list on a tablet. "It's just a test event for my new contemporary art exhibit project. Using the house as a venue, elegant and cost-effective. Win-win." I looked around, forcing my voice to stay calm. "You're turning my home into your marketing prop." She smiled sweetly, too sweet. "Our home, Bea? And really, you should be proud. It'll be featured in Architectural Living next month." Before I could respond, Daniel walked in, navy suit, polished shoes, smile rehearsed. It's just a small gathering, Mom. Don't stress. Lila wants to impress some investors, that's all. I stared at him for a long time. The little boy who once wore a paper crown and called me his queen was gone. In his place stood a man too tired, too scared of conflict to see what was happening. Evening fell quickly. Cars lined the driveway. Golden light poured through the stained glass, bouncing off the walls that had once echoed with Harold's laughter. From my study, I heard the murmur of voices' laughter, like blades slicing through silence. When I finally stepped out, the house wasn't mine anymore. Everything had been rearranged, the long table covered in linen candles, flickering soft jazz humming from wireless speakers. Guests laughed, toasted, mingled freely. No one noticed the old woman standing at the edge of the stairs, the one who built this place brick by brick. I walked slowly toward the dining room. A small sign at the head of the table read, "Lila and Daniel Langford hosts," and my name at the far end near the kitchen door. Lila looked up, sugar in her tone. "Oh good, you changed perfect timing. Sit there, Bea. I'll handle the introductions." I sat gripping my glass tightly. Humiliation seeped in, quiet and heavy. A blonde woman turned to me. "This house is beautiful. How long ago did you buy it?" Before I could answer, Lila chimed in smoothly. "We moved in last year. It's an old property, but we've modernized it. I kept some vintage touches, of course." Each word hit like a slap. We moved in, as if I were some ghost who came with the furniture. Trying to steady myself, I joined the conversation. In 1990, Harold and I hosted a Cambridge professor right here in this room. Lila's bright laugh cut me off. "Oh, Beatrice has so many of these stories. Listening to her is like time traveling." The table erupted in polite laughter. I looked at Daniel. He laughed too. Not loudly, but enough to make my heart break. Betrayed twice. Once by a stranger and once by my own blood. I set down my fork. The clang rang sharp against the plate. I didn't speak again. When dessert came, I looked toward the fireplace. The honeymoon photo of Harold and me was gone. In its place stood a polished silver urn, the one Lila bragged about getting for a steal at auction. Its surface caught the candlelight and distorted my face into something unrecognizable. Lila stood raising her glass. A toast to new partnerships, fresh beginnings, and a bright future. And to Beatrice Langford, whose sense of history inspired us to reimagine this home. That word reimagine sent a chill down my spine. Everyone applauded. They thought I was being honored. But really they were applauding the funeral of my memories. Quietly I said, "This house doesn't need to be reimagined. It just needs to be respected." Lila smiled, eyes cold as steel. "Don't be so sensitive, Bea. The world's changing." After dinner, I retreated upstairs. Music still throbbed faintly through the floorboards. I sat by the window watching the garden swallowed in darkness. My chest ached, a mix of fury and emptiness. Rosa knocked softly, carrying tea. "Ma'am, some of the guests downstairs thought you were a distant relative." I gave a thin smile. Maybe that's what Lila wants. She sat beside me. "If Mr. Harold were alive, he'd never let anyone treat you this way." I gazed out the window. And that's exactly why they dare to now. Hours later, cars pulled away. Candles fizzled out. The house fell quiet. I was just about to turn off the light when I heard voices downstairs. Lila's sharp tone slicing through the silence. "Be careful with that, Rosa. That vase is worth nearly 10 grand. A chill ran through me. That vase, the one she'd placed where Harold's photo used to be. I stepped out of my room, moving slowly down the stairs. Candlelight flickered off glass, painting ghostly reflections across the walls. The air reeked of wax and lilies. On the table, I noticed a business card that had fallen to the floor. Heart PR Agency, Lila Langford, Senior Consultant. On the back, a handwritten note read, "Host your next event at the Langford House where elegance meets history." A bitter laugh escaped me. My home now an advertising prop. I walked to the fireplace, staring at the silver urn again. Moonlight glinted off the base, and that's when I saw it engraved initials, H.L. Harold Langford. My blood froze. This wasn't some auction piece. It was Harold's urn, the one I'd kept in the attic since the funeral. She had taken his ashes and turned them into decor. A wave of cold swept through me. My knees trembled. I had to grip the wall to stay upright. She hadn't just invaded my home, she had desecrated his memory. "Rosa," I called softly. No answer. Only the steady ticking of the clock, like the heartbeat of someone barely holding on. I realized then every boundary had been crossed. This wasn't about plates or curtains anymore. It was a full invasion. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd underestimated me. I, Beatrice Langford, was once the wife of a diplomat. I know laws. I know leverage. And I know how to strike quietly but effectively. I climbed the stairs, opened Harold's old desk, and pulled out the leather notebook he left behind. Inside were everything: the deed share certificates, ownership documents. I set it gently on the desk, ran my fingers over the cover, and whispered, "Harold, I won't let them turn you into decoration. I promise." Then I began to write every insult, every lie, every change they made. Lila's words, Daniel's silence, the portrait, the urn, all of it. I opened my laptop and typed my first official statement, saving a copy and emailing it to Arthur Beaumont, our family lawyer. Before I went to bed, I looked out the window. Moonlight reflected off my face in the glass, not weak anymore. There was a storm rising inside me. And this time, I wouldn't stop it. If you were me, would you stay silent for the sake of family or stand up for your own dignity? Tell me what you think. Do you agree or disagree with my choice? Share your thoughts in the comments, because in this story, I truly want to know, whose side are you on? That night I couldn't sleep. Pale moonlight lay across the hallway rug, quiet as the breath of a watching spirit. Every creak of the wooden floor made me jump, afraid someone was moving in the dark, but it was only me in the silence. I sat up, put on my robe, and stepped out of my room. Cold air slid down my collar and stung my skin. I went downstairs where the silver urn still sat on the mantel. I walked closer and looked carefully. In the dim light, the letters HL showed even clearer. It was Harold's urn, the husband I loved more than life. She had brought it down and set it in front of strangers to show off her modern taste. Anger boiled in me. It felt like my veins were shouting. But instead of smashing that urn, I took out my phone, turned on the camera, and filmed the whole room. The urn. The table still littered with wine glasses, the napkin with a guest's signature, and the little sign that read, "Lila and Daniel Langford, hosts." Every detail, every piece of proof I recorded carefully. As I put my phone away, I heard a cupboard door click. From the kitchen corner, Lila stepped out holding a glass of wine. "Still up?" "What are you filming?" I turned my voice steadier than I expected. "I'm keeping a record of the changes in my house." She laughed, sharp and mean. "Our house bee. Remember, Daniel is the sole heir. You're just staying here for now?" I looked straight into her eyes. "I haven't signed any power of attorney." Her gaze stopped for half a second, then she smirked. "Really, I thought Daniel took care of that. That Arthur guy reached out to us to review the paperwork." A cold line ran down my back. "Arthur, my family attorney, contacted them. No, that couldn't be." Lila turned and kept talking light as if telling a joke. Anyway, you should think about a care home, Bea. Quiet with people to help you. This house, I'll make it an art space. We'll call it Langford Hall, elegant and high-end. What do you think? I didn't answer. I stepped closer and laid my hand on the silver urn. If you want to turn this house into something you want, start by respecting the man who built it. Lila laughed and poured more wine. Your time is over. Don't cling to what's outdated. This is my time now. She walked away, leaving the mix of wine and perfume in the air, thick and choking. I stood there a long time. In the dying candlelight, I swore to Harold I would not let this home become a stage for the ungrateful. The next morning, I called Arthur. Arthur, did you contact Daniel or his wife about the house papers? He sounded surprised. Absolutely not, Bea. I only work with you. What happened? I told him everything, the party, the urn, and Lila's words. He was silent for a while, then said, It's time to review all ownership records. If any copies are missing, we act at once. We set a meeting for the next morning. I hung up feeling a little lighter, but my gut still churned. Something in this house was being moved behind the scenes, and I couldn't just sit and wait. That afternoon, I was in the study when I heard Rosa call urgent Mrs. Beatrice. You need to see this. I hurried down. Rosa held Harold's old phone, the one I thought was broken. The screen lit up with a notification from the internal camera system he'd installed years ago. Her hands shook as she pointed to the clip last night. 1:47 a.m. I pressed play. The hallway camera showed a grainy scene, Daniel and Lila standing by the wooden file cabinet. Lila held a flashlight. Daniel spoke in a low voice. Hurry, she'll wake up. Lila replied, I just need the power of attorney copy. Remember, Arthur sent a draft by email. If we can match her signature, the rest is simple. I heard it clearly. Every word stabbed my heart. Rosa covered her mouth, stunned. My God, they're going to fake your signature. I nodded, eyes burning, but I didn't cry. I only said, thank you, Rosa. Now we know what to do. I exported the video, saved it to a separate drive, then sent a copy to Arthur with a short note, I have evidence. Later, when Daniel came home, he walked into the living room and saw me sitting there. Mom, are you okay? You look tired. I looked straight at him. What were you and Lila doing at the file cabinet last night? He froze, then tried to smile. What do you mean we didn't? I held up my phone and played a few seconds of the clip. His face went pale. He stammered, You're misunderstanding. Lila just wanted to check some papers. Forging my signature is helping too. He didn't answer. Lila came in from the kitchen and had heard enough. She stayed calm. Oh, please, you're exaggerating. I just looked at a draft. Don't make a scene, Bea. I stood, my voice cold. You crossed the line, Lila. I won't let this pass. She scoffed and turned to Daniel. See, she's paranoid. Getting worse? Daniel stayed silent, eyes avoiding mine. I didn't wait. I went upstairs, closed my door, and one thought beat in my head. They don't just want the house. They want to erase me. That night, Rosa and I quietly moved all documents into the safe and changed the code. I also uploaded another copy to the cloud for Arthur with this instruction, if I can't be reached, open the file and release everything. Rosa looked at me worried. What are you going to do? I smiled and answered softly, let them fall into their own trap. Let them think I'm weak. Quiet people make schemers careless. When I blew out the last candle, the house seemed to settle. I knew the real storm was close, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had proof, a plan, and faith that the truth stands with those who don't give up. If you've ever been dismissed, treated like a burden by your own family, remember that silence can be a kind of strength. Do you think I should show them the full video now or wait and strike at the final moment? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you can go with me to the very end of this story where justice will speak in a way no one expects. The next morning, the sky was a solid gray. Rain whispered against the windows, tracing cold streaks down the glass. I sat by the window, teacup in hand, staring at what used to be a garden full of violet blooms, now replaced by rows of lifeless succulents. The house was unnervingly quiet, but I knew peace was only a thin layer before the real storm arrived. Around noon, the front door opened. Daniel came in, rain dripping from his coat, his face drawn and weary. Behind him was Lila, holding a large envelope. She smiled faintly. "B, we have something to discuss. We hope you'll cooperate." I didn't move from my chair. I don't remember agreeing to a meeting. "True." She said, her tone syrupy, "but this is important. It's for your own good." She set the envelope on the table. Her voice was soft but sharp as a blade. "This is a draft of a legal power of attorney. We've already spoken with Arthur Beaumont. He'll finalize it soon. You just need to sign here." I let out a small laugh. "Arthur would never do that without me." "You're lying." Daniel stepped in, trying to sound calm. "Mom, you're not getting any younger. Lila and I just want to make sure everything is handled properly. We can protect your assets, the house, the estate, all of it." I placed my teacup down and rose slowly. "Protect me, or protect yourselves?" He looked away. Lila didn't. Her eyes gleamed with challenge. "If you were smart, you'd realize fighting your own son won't get you anywhere." The room felt colder. I stared at the envelope, just a thin sheet of paper, but I could feel the greed seeping from it. Silently, I opened a drawer and pulled out a small silver USB stick. "I have a document too," I said evenly. "And what might that be?" she asked, clearly bored. I plugged the drive into the laptop on the desk. The screen lit up and the video began to play, the footage from the hidden camera, Daniel and Lila sneaking around the file cabinet, whispering, "Hurry! I just need the copy of the power of attorney." Silence. Daniel went pale. Lila froze for a heartbeat, then snapped up from her seat. "This is fake. You edited that video to frame us." I met her gaze calmly. "If I edited it, why does your voice shake exactly when you talk about the forged signature?" Daniel stood motionless. Lila tried to regain control. "Even if it's real, it doesn't prove anything legally. You have no case." I smiled faintly. "Really, I've already sent the original file to my lawyer and to an old friend in the police department. If anything happens to me, that footage goes public immediately." A long silence followed. Outside, the rain grew heavier, each drop against the glass echoing like the house's racing heartbeat. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low. "Mom, I don't want this to go too far." "Then stop, Daniel, before it's too late." He didn't answer. Lila grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "Let's go. Don't let her guilt you." Her tone was razor sharp. Before leaving, she turned back. "You'll regret this." The door slammed. The sound rang through the house like a declaration of war. That afternoon, Arthur arrived carrying a thick stack of papers. After watching the video, his face turned grave. "If they tried to forge your signature, that's criminal bay." "I don't want to charge my son," I said quietly. "I just want to protect what Harold left. Then we'll stay one step ahead. We'll rewrite the will, transfer the house into a heritage trust. Once that's done, no one can sell, mortgage, or transfer it. The property will belong to the city's historical registry under your and Harold's names." I looked out the window. The reflection of the rain blended my face with Harold's portrait on the wall. "Do it, Arthur, and do it quickly." 3 days later, the paperwork was complete. I signed each page with a steady hand. When the final line dried in ink, I felt my heartbeat steady again. The house was safe, but I wasn't done. I opened my laptop and sent an anonymous email to Lila and Daniel attaching a photo of the video still. Subject line, I know everything. No threats, no demands, just truth. That night, I heard their car leave. The gate shut with a heavy thud echoing in the damp air. I sat on the porch sipping Earl Grey, letting the scent of bergamot mix with the night breeze. Rosa came over wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. You've won, haven't you? I smiled softly, my gaze distant. No, Rosa, this isn't victory. It's only the beginning. The real storm is still on its way. And I was right. 2 days later, Lila returned alone. Her face was pale eyes sunken from sleeplessness. What do you want, B, money? Or to humiliate us more, I spoke quietly. I don't want money. I just want you to leave this house and never come back. Daniel won't agree. He'll have to. The house doesn't belong to anyone now. It's under preservation. Even if you wanted to sell it, you couldn't. Lila trembled, then suddenly broke down. I froze. I had never seen her like this. You don't understand, she said through tears. Daniel's losing his job. His project was cut. I just wanted to save him. I stayed silent for a moment. Maybe buried beneath her schemes there was a trace of love. But love never justifies betrayal. I simply said, if you really want to save him, let him face the truth. Don't drag him down with you. She looked at me one last time, tears streaming, then left. The sound of her heels on the wood floor echoed, fading, until the house was quiet again. I sat down feeling a strange emptiness. Not triumph, not anger, just peace. The kind that feels earned. Outside, the sky cleared at last. A faint sunlight broke through the clouds, shining on the silver urn, resting peacefully on the mantel. I walked over, laid my hand gently on it, and whispered, Harold, it's almost over. If you were me, could you have softened at those tears? Or would you have done what I did, stopped before pity made you weak? Tell me what you would have done, and don't forget to follow, because the truth is only beginning to reveal itself, and justice is about to call every name it must. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, catching the silver urn and making it glow, a symbol of memory and of a promise kept. I sat at my writing desk, papers spread neatly before me, Arthur's final documents confirming the transfer of ownership. Every line was sealed and notarized, the Langford house, and its entire collection now officially belonged to the Langford Preservation Trust, beyond the reach of anyone who had ever tried to take it. Rosa entered quietly, with tea setting the cup down beside me. Mrs. Beatrice, I still can't believe it's all over. I smiled faintly. No, Rosa, the paperwork is done. But people take longer. That afternoon, Arthur returned carrying another folder. His handwriting was as precise as his voice. I've finished your new will, B. Everything's clear. The house and collection belong to the Preservation Trust. The Harold Langford Scholarship will be established. I've also listed 2 honorary beneficiaries, Rosa Alvarez and Nora Whitman. A warmth filled my chest. Thank you, Arthur. They deserve it. He looked up, eyes full of quiet respect. Would you like me to arrange a public reading of the will? I nodded slowly. Yes. I want them to hear it themselves. I want them to know that my silence was never weakness. Arthur scheduled it for 2 days later. I knew when that day came, every mask would fall. That evening, I walked to the back garden, the one where Harold had once planted the first row of violets. The soil was damp with rain, the air thick with the scent of earth. Kneeling down, I pressed a new violet stem into the ground, one Rosa had brought from the church. In the hush of the night, I whispered, "Do you see Harold? The house still lives, and so do I." I didn't expect Daniel to come that night. He knocked without warning. When I opened the door, his face was drawn and tired eyes red from sleeplessness. He stood there for a long moment before he could speak. "I'm sorry, Mom." I kept my voice calm. "Sorry for what, Daniel?" "For letting Lila manipulate me. I thought you were trying to control everything, but it was me who was being controlled." I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. We sat across from each other in the quiet living room that had once held so many arguments, now still as stone. "I've already forgiven you," I said. "But forgiveness isn't forgetting. The cost of blindness is what you're living now." He nodded. "I lost my job, Mom. Mark said the scandal ruined the firm's reputation. Lila, she left." I said nothing. Perhaps fate was already doing the work I no longer needed to. He looked up, voice trembling. "I'm not here for money or the house. I just want your forgiveness." I met his eyes. "Forgiveness, yes, but trust that you'll have to rebuild on your own. Some things once lost can't be bought back with words." He lowered his head, tears streaking down his face. I rose, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow you'll be here when Arthur reads the will. Listen carefully. You'll see what I've prepared for you even after everything." Daniel said nothing more. When he left, my heart felt heavy and light all at once. Some children need to lose everything before they understand the value of a mother's embrace. The next morning I rose early. I put on the black dress Harold once said made me look ready for battle, beautiful and unbreakable. Perhaps he was right. Arthur, Rosa, and Nora arrived first. They helped arrange the chairs in the library where sunlight spilled through stained glass, painting the floor with ribbons of gold and red. Soon after, Daniel entered alone. He looked around, noting Lila's absence, then nodded to me quietly. Arthur adjusted his glasses and began to read. His voice was steady and solemn like a requiem. According to the last will and testament of Mrs. Beatrice Langford, the entirety of her property, including the Langford residence and its historical artifacts, will be transferred to the Langford Preservation Trust, established to protect the home's cultural and historical value. At that moment, Lila appeared late, pausing at the doorway, her face drained of color. Arthur continued. The city of Salem will act as trustee under the supervision of Mrs. Nora Whitman. Additionally, Mrs. Rosa Alvarez shall receive lifetime pension benefits and an honorary position within the trust. I watched Daniel bow his head and Lila stand, frozen lips trembling. Arthur looked down at the final page and read, "The remaining inheritance designated for Mr. Daniel Langford and Mrs. Lila Hart shall be transferred to the Harold Langford Scholarship Fund, a foundation supporting students in the field of art restoration. The only condition neither beneficiary may exploit or use the Langford name for personal or financial gain." Silence filled the room. Only the clock's slow ticking remained. Lila shot up, voice shrill. "You can't do this. This is our family estate." Arthur's tone remained calm. "Mrs. Beatrice Langford is the sole legal owner. All transfers have been completed and certified by the court." Daniel reached for her hand, whispering, "Enough." I looked at them both and felt a strange ache, not anger, just sorrow for children who never learned that greed never leads to happiness. When the reading ended, Arthur gathered the papers. I turned to Daniel. "Start over, my son, with your own two hands, not with this name, not with anyone else's." For the first time in years, his eyes reminded me of Harold's gentle, humble, filled with regret. "I will, Mom." I nodded, then looked toward the window. The last rays of sunlight spilled across the garden where tiny violet buds had begun to open. Their color was soft yet steady like me, and like every woman who's ever been pushed to her limit, but still found the strength to rise again quietly. When everyone left, I stayed behind in the old library. The clock struck 7, its chime echoing through the house. I sat down, placed my hand on the will, and whispered, "Justice may come slowly, but when it does, it heals everything." Outside, the light poured through the windows, falling across Harold's portrait. I smiled, truly smiled for the first time in months. Everything at last was back where it belonged. But life has a habit of testing us, especially when we think peace has finally settled in. 2 days after the will was read, a strange letter arrived at the house. No sender, just a messy scrawl on the envelope. "You think you've won Rosa," brought it to me. Her face pale. I opened it. Inside was a photograph of the will reading so sharp you could see every expression. Underneath, written in red ink, were the words, "We will take it all back." I knew immediately who it was. Only Lila had that mix of recklessness and spite. I folded the photo, placed it back in the envelope, and locked it away. Not out of fear, but because I understood that when a person loses everything, recklessness is the only weapon they have left. That night I called Arthur. He came right away, his usual composure replaced by concern. "B, you should get away for a few days. I have a cabin in Maine, quiet, safe." I shook my head. "Arthur, I'm not leaving. This is Harold's house. My memories live here. If someone wants to threaten me, they can do it to my face." He sighed. "Still as unyielding as the day I met you. Just be careful. Lila has nothing left to lose." Later, I sat alone in the study. The yellow lamplight pooled over the stacks of books. Harold's old clock ticked steadily, the one sound that kept me company. I opened his old journal and traced the words he'd written the day we bought this house. "A home only lives as long as there's honesty within its walls." I smiled softly, then closed it. But only minutes later, a sound came from outside, faint metallic. My heart jumped. The window shivered as if touched. Pulling back the curtain, I saw nothing but darkness and the trembling of trees in the wind. Yet when the hall light flickered across the yard, I saw it clearly, a single footprint pressed into the wet soil leading straight to the cellar door. Rosa heard it too and came running. I raised a hand for silence. We took a flashlight and stepped out into the drizzle. The air carried the cold breath of the lake. When we reached the cellar, the lock hung broken. "Oh my God, Mrs. Beatrice, someone's inside," Rosa whispered, her hands shaking. I motioned for her to stay calm and gently pushed the door open. Damp air rushed out thick with rust and dust. In the beam of the flashlight, a shape flickered at the far end where I kept old files and relics. "Who's there?" I called, my voice hard as steel. No reply, just a clatter of something hitting the floor. I stepped carefully down each old wooden stair, groaning beneath my feet. When the light finally hit her face, I froze. Lila. She stood clutching a bundle of papers, eyes wild. "You're good at hiding things, Bea. A lifetime of lies, and you still preach about honesty." I tightened my grip on the flashlight. "What are you doing here, taking back what's mine?" She waved the papers, the old deed Harold had once kept down here long before the transfer. "Those documents mean nothing," I said evenly. "The ownership's already changed." "I know," she screamed. "But the world doesn't. I can show these make them believe you tricked your own son." Her eyes were feverish, teetering between rage and despair. "You'll only burn yourself, Lila," she laughed bitterly. "Then we burn together." Rosa cried out as Lila lunged, the papers scattered like snow. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, but Rosa caught me small, trembling but fierce enough to stand between us. "She's given you enough chances," Rosa shouted. "If you have any decency left, leave this place." Lila froze, the light trembling across her tear-streaked face. And then suddenly she broke sobs, bursting out of her raw and uneven. Not the sound of an enemy, but of someone utterly broken. "I have nothing," she choked. "No home, no husband, no name. Do you know what they call me now? The woman who destroyed her own life with her bare hands." I stood silent. In the middle of my anger, something in me softened just a little. "Lila," I said quietly, "that's the price of greed. But it's not too late to start over." She looked up hollow-eyed. "You really think I can start over? If you can still feel shame, you can still begin again." She stared at me for a long moment, then bent to gather the fallen papers. Her voice was flat. "I'll go. But remember, this justice has two sides." And she walked out into the rain, her figure fading into the mist. Rosa turned to me, still shaking. "Do you think she'll come back?" "I don't know," I murmured. "But if she can still cry, she won't risk losing what little humanity she has left." We gathered the scattered papers, locked them back inside the metal trunk, and replaced the broken padlock. When we stepped out, the rain had stopped. The sky had opened just enough for a thin crescent moon to rise like an ellipsis at the end of chaos. The next morning, Arthur called. The police found Lila at the Boston station. She's on a southbound train. Looks like she's really gone this time. I exhaled softly. "Thank you, Arthur. Let her go." Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need words, just distance. That evening I sat in the garden beside the newly blossomed violets. Rosa poured tea and placed the cup beside me, saying nothing. We listened to the birds and the wind. In that quiet, I realized something every woman who's ever survived betrayal reaches this same moment, the moment she knows she's finally free. I looked up at the window where Harold once stood, reading his morning paper, feeling as if he were still watching. "We kept our home, Harold," I whispered. "Not through law, but through resolve. If you've ever been betrayed, ever stood between letting go and fighting back, you'll know this feeling, not victory, but the calm after the storm. Do you believe that forgiveness can sometimes be the strongest form of revenge? Tell me what you think in the comments, because sometimes the words you share might become the very strength someone else needs to go on." That afternoon, after several calm, windless days, another letter appeared at the front gate. No return name, but I knew instantly. The trembling hand, the slightly tilted letters, they could only belong to Daniel. I opened the envelope and found a short note, just a few lines. "Mom, I'm trying to fix things, but I don't know where to start. I want to see you. I need your forgiveness, not just in words. I'll come tonight." I folded the letter and sat in the study for a long while. Every stroke of ink carried the echo of the boy he once was, the boy who used to hold my hand when thunder scared him, who once promised he'd protect me forever. But between us now lay a distance unseen, built from betrayal, silence, and shame. Rosa came in, saw my expression, and asked softly, "What's wrong, Mrs. Beatrice?" I handed her the letter. After reading it, she sighed. "Will you see him?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. Whatever he's done, he's still my son." That evening, right at 7, the sound of a car stopped at the gate. Daniel stepped out no longer the proud man who once stood beside Lila at that glittering dinner years ago. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes hollow, his hands fidgeting like someone who had weathered a long storm. He paused at the steps unsure. I opened the door and said evenly, "Come in, Daniel." He entered, glancing around the house, the home that used to be his now quiet, dignified, almost museum-like, yet still warm with the scent of family. We sat in the parlor. Candlelight flickered our shadows long and apart, like two timelines that could no longer meet. I don't even know what to say," he began, voice trembling. I stayed silent, letting him find his own words. "I've lost everything, Mom. The company let me go, the project collapsed, my friends avoid me." Lila left without a word, just a note saying she needed peace. I set my teacup down gently. "Who are you trying to find, Daniel, me? Or yourself?" He looked up, eyes red. "Maybe both. I thought I was protecting our family, but I forgot you were the one who built it." A long pause. The clock ticked slow and heavy. I studied him and saw beneath the weariness traces of the man Harold once hoped he'd become buried under too much pride. "I don't hate you," I said softly, "but I was disappointed because you stayed silent when you should have spoken." He lowered his head, tears falling. "I know. That night, when Lila slapped you, I wanted to stop her. But I was afraid to lose her, afraid to seem weak. Now I understand silence in the face of wrong is the same as doing wrong." I walked to the mantel where Harold's portrait hung. "Your father once told me love isn't measured by promises, but by how you act when things fall apart. You haven't lost everything yet, Daniel. If you truly want to make it right, start by becoming the man your father could be proud of." He stood, voice breaking. "Do you think I still have a chance?" "There's always a chance for those who bow their heads not to beg, but to learn how to stand again." I handed him a small envelope. He opened it. Inside was a letter from Arthur, an introduction to an art restoration institute in Portland, one I had quietly supported through Harold's trust. "This is the last opportunity I can give you," I said. "An unpaid apprenticeship. If you want to start over, do it honestly. Leave the Langford name behind." Daniel clutched the letter, tears splashing onto the table. Then he knelt and took my hands. "Mom, thank you. I don't deserve this." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to deserve it, son. You just need to be honest." Rosa stood in the doorway, eyes glistening. I gestured gently for her to leave us alone. The two of us stayed there, surrounded by the soft light of the candles. Daniel stayed late into the night. We spoke of small things, the soup Harold loved the winter when Rick was little, the New Year's Eve dinners filled with piano music. Sometimes memories are the only glue strong enough to mend what once seemed beyond repair. Before leaving, Daniel turned and asked Mom, "May I visit sometimes? Maybe help in the garden or tend to the library?" I smiled. "If you do it out of love, not guilt, my door will always be open." He nodded and stepped into the night. The sound of his car faded slowly. I stayed at the window, feeling both lighter and lonelier than I had in years. The next morning, Arthur called. The Art Institute of Portland just emailed me. They were impressed with Daniel's application. It seems he's truly trying. I smiled faintly. If that's true, then Harold must be smiling too. That afternoon, Rosa and I began organizing the library. At one point, she looked up and asked quietly, "Don't you ever get tired after all they did to you?" I looked up and smiled. "Of course I do. But forgiveness isn't about whether they deserve it. It's about whether I deserve peace. Late sunlight poured through the window, spilling over the books over Rosa's face and over Harold's empty reading chair. The room felt alive again, gentle breathing whole. I brewed another pot of tea, handed her a cup. The scent of bergamot filled the air. Outside, the first autumn wind rustled the violet blossoms, their petals trembling as if whispering secrets. I looked out at them and said softly, "People think justice is cold, but sometimes justice arrives dressed as compassion." Rosa smiled. "And you, Mrs. Beatrice. You're living proof of that. If you've ever had to choose between revenge and forgiveness, you'll understand not everyone is strong enough to take the second road. So tell me, which would you choose to fight for retribution or to forgive for peace?" Share your thoughts below, because sometimes your words might be the light someone else needs to find their way through the storm. I sat by the window long after Rosa had gone to bed. Outside night mist softened the glass panes, reflecting the warm glow of the lamps inside. The house, once a battlefield, had finally returned to its true nature, a refuge, a soul. And yet in the quiet, I felt a faint emptiness, as if something still waited to be closed. The next morning the phone rang. It was Arthur. His voice was tight. "Beatrice, you should see the Boston Chronicle today." I opened the paper. On page 3 was a bold headline, "The Langford Inheritance. The Disinherited Son Speaks." Beneath it was an interview with Daniel's photo. He said he was learning to make amends and wanted to warn others not to lose their families to greed. Not a single word blaming me. No mention of money. No trace of Lila. Arthur exhaled softly on the line. "He did the right thing, Bea. You can rest easy now." I folded the newspaper. My chest tightened with something hard to name, pride, sorrow, forgiveness all at once. Daniel had finally learned what I'd always hoped for, to stand tall on his own honor. That afternoon another call came, a woman's voice shaky and unfamiliar. "Mrs. Langford, it's Lila." I paused. "I didn't expect to hear from you. I know, you don't owe me your time, but I wanted to tell you I met Daniel in Portland. He doesn't hate me. He said we each have to live with what we've done. I'm applying for a job at a small museum. For the first time, I just want to do something real." Her voice trembled, stripped of arrogance. For the first time, she sounded human. "I won't wish you luck," I said softly, "but I'll wish you clarity. Luck means nothing without understanding." "Thank you." "And I'm sorry. Truly." The call ended. I stared at my tea, watching the steam rise and fade like the past finally lifting. Maybe when people have heard enough, they start seeking the light on their own. The next day, Rosa, Arthur, and I welcomed a team of architects from the City Heritage Council. They'd come to prepare the Langford house for its new life as a museum. Emily, the young project leader, beamed as she walked through the doorway. "Mrs. Beatrice will preserve nearly everything, just add lighting and safety systems. This is one of the few historic homes left intact." I nodded, my gaze wandering across the shelves, the fireplace, Harold's portrait. "Don't change too much. Every crack in these walls holds a memory." Emily smiled warmly. "Of course. We want visitors to feel the story of a woman who stood firm through every storm." Her words made me pause. I had never thought my life worth telling, but maybe resilience itself is a kind of legacy. When they left, Rosa and I began dusting old boxes in the study. Inside one, I found an envelope tucked deep beneath papers Harold's handwriting. The paper had yellowed. The date read March 12th, 1999. My hands trembled as I opened it. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to remind you Beatrice stays strong, even when people change, because your kindness will be the greatest legacy you leave this world." Tears blurred the ink, but oddly, I didn't feel grief, only peace. It felt like Harold was still here guiding me one last time. That evening, I invited Arthur and Rosa to stay for dinner. We had onion soup and Harold's favorite red wine. Candlelight flickered across the walls, painting soft shadows that made the room glow like a painting. Arthur raised his glass. To justice finally finding its way home. I smiled, and to kindness the only thing that kept it standing. Rosa's eyes sparkled. He's smiling up there, you know. I nodded. Yes, I can feel it. The house filled with gentle laughter, the first true laughter in months. Later that night, I stepped onto the porch. The scent of blooming violets floated through the cool air. Moonlight covered the steps in silver. I closed my eyes and listened to the insects, to the wind, and somewhere deep inside to Harold's voice. You did it, Bea, he whispered in memory. You kept our home safe. I smiled toward the sky. I only did what you taught me, to never let anyone control my life, not even fate. Back inside, I lit a candle beside Harold's photograph and placed the old letter next to it. The flame flickered, casting light over the inscription Beatrice Langford, 1948, 2025. And I realized a new chapter had begun, not one of loss, but of rebirth. The next morning, Daniel called. His voice was calm, lighter than I'd ever heard it. Mom, I officially started work today. They said I have an eye for restoration. Maybe your blood really does run in me. I laughed softly, eyes wet. I don't need you to be successful, Daniel. I just need you to stay true. I promise, Mom. After the call, I stood by the window watching sunlight spill over the violet garden. Something inside me felt complete, like life had begun flowing forward again, carrying love and forgiveness with it. Rosa brought me tea. Mrs. Beatrice, it feels like everything's truly beginning anew. I nodded, sipping slowly. Yes, Rosa. But this time I'm not afraid to lose anything because I've learned how to keep myself. And that's something no one can ever take. If you've ever stood at the edge between hatred and forgiveness, you'll understand true victory isn't making others kneel. It's being able to smile without bitterness. Do you believe that sometimes kindness itself is the highest form of justice? Tell me what you think, because maybe your answer will become the beautiful ending to another story out there waiting to heal. 3 weeks later, the Langford House was officially recognized as a private cultural heritage site of the city of Salem. A bronze plaque was placed at the front gate, Langford House, where time and kindness meet. On the morning of the opening, crowds gathered, reporters, art students, and neighbors who had once whispered about the mother driven from her own home by her daughter-in-law. I stood on the front steps in a simple blue dress, looking around at the restored space. Every photograph, every crack in the wall stood as proof that this house had survived the war of family and won. Arthur came to stand beside me, smiling softly. Beatrice, you should be proud. Not everyone has the strength to turn a wound into a legacy. I replied quietly. I only did what needed to be done. The rest belongs to justice. He nodded, and to forgiveness. When the ribbon cutting began, Daniel appeared. He wore a modest suit and looked calmer, more grounded than ever before. The crowd murmured as he walked toward me, and among them I caught sight of Lila, her hair tied neatly, her expression gentle, almost serene. Daniel took the microphone, his voice steady. My name is Daniel Langford. I once made the greatest mistake of my life, letting pride and ambition turn me against the woman who gave me everything. But today, I'm not here to justify myself. I'm here to say thank you to my mother, who showed me that kindness can be stronger than judgment. My chest tightened. The son who once made me cry now made me proud." He bowed, stepped down, and when our eyes met, no words were needed, only a small nod, the kind that says everything language cannot. After the ceremony, visitors lingered. A group of art students came to me asking about the house's history. They called me Mrs. Langford, the keeper of Salem's soul. I smiled and told them about Harold, the man who built the old clock in the parlor, about the dinners once filled with laughter and music, and about the days I thought this home might never breathe again. In the corner, Lila approached. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said softly, "but I want to thank you for not destroying me when you could have." Her eyes no longer held arrogance, only humility. "Lila," I replied, "what destroys people isn't failure. It's refusing to learn from it. If you've truly changed, then live kindly. That's the only apology that matters." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I'll try, Mrs. Beatrice." That afternoon, after everyone left, I walked into the back garden. Sunlight spilled across the violet trellis in full bloom. Rosa brought out 2 cups of tea, setting them on the wooden table. "See, Mrs. Beatrice. Everything's different now. I remember when this house echoed with shouting. Now it's just the wind." I took a sip and smiled, because in the end what remains after every battle isn't victory or defeat, it's silence. A few minutes later, Daniel stepped onto the porch. "Mom, the magazine Heritage Voices wants to interview you. They say your story inspired people." I chuckled. If someone finds themselves in it, that's enough. "I don't need praise, Daniel. I only want people to understand that truth and kindness never contradict each other." He smiled, the same bright look he'd had as a boy. "I'll remember that." That evening I stayed alone in the library. Moonlight stretched across the wooden floor. I opened a new journal and wrote the first line. "We must learn to let go without resentment, to hold on without selfishness. Only then can we truly be free." I looked up. The room was warm again. Harold's photo above the fireplace seemed to smile. "You see, Harold," I whispered. "Everything's finally all right." Rosa entered carrying a letter. The envelope bore the seal of the Portland Art Institute. I opened it, a letter from the director. "We are deeply impressed by Daniel Langford. He works with integrity and care and is now leading the antique clock restoration project. He says it makes him feel closer to his parents." I reread it, my lips trembling. The same son who once broke my heart was now continuing the legacy Harold left behind. I folded the letter and placed it beside Harold's photo. Outside, the wind stirred the violets, and one petal drifted through the open window, landing on the half-written page of my journal. I pressed it between the lines, a quiet punctuation from fate itself. Later that night, I stepped onto the porch. The autumn sky was clear, stars glittering above. Moonlight brushed over the silver urn on the table, Harold's resting place. I touched it gently and whispered, "I'm not alone anymore." I sat down, the cool night air brushing my skin. Behind me, the house glowed softly through the windows, a small lighthouse against the dark. And in that moment, I finally understood a home isn't made of brick and wood, but of the souls it heals. Rosa appeared with a shawl, draping it over my shoulders. "Are you planning to stay out here all night?" I smiled. "No, I'm just listening to time. It's telling me I'm still alive and still have things left to love." Far off, the clock chimed 12 deep notes echoing through the night. I closed my eyes and whispered an old prayer. "Thank you for the pain, the betrayal, the lessons, and the people who forced me to become strong. If you've ever lost something precious, believe this: nothing is gone forever. It only transforms waiting for the moment you're calm enough to see it. Have you ever found peace after your own storm? Share it with me, because maybe your story will be the faith someone else needs to find their way home. The next morning I woke to soft autumn sunlight spilling across the room. The scent of violets from the back garden drifted through the window, the same fragrance that used to greet me when Harold was still alive. I brewed a pot of tea and sat quietly, feeling lighter than I had in decades, as if the weight I'd carried all my life had finally lifted. The house was calm now. No more arguments, no footsteps sneaking through the night. Only the quiet breath of peace, something I once believed I'd never feel again. Near noon, the doorbell rang. Daniel stood there holding a bouquet of bright purple violets. His smile was genuine this time, no longer shadowed by guilt or shame. "Mom," he said, "these are from the garden at the Institute. I planted them and I think of you every day." I took the flowers smiling. Violets, the flowers of perseverance. Your father chose them for this garden, remember I do. Now I understand why. They don't bloom loudly, but they endure through rainfrost and silence. We sat together on the porch, sunlight glinting through the ivy. Daniel told me about his work. He was restoring a 19th century clock, and the museum planned to display it at Langford House once it was done. "I want it to be in memory of Dad," he said. I nodded. Harold would be proud, and so am I. For a while we sat without speaking. I looked at my son, the same man who once broke my heart, and realized that time really can heal if we have the courage to face ourselves. Later, Rosa brought out tea, smiling at us. "It's amazing," she said. "This house used to feel like a storm. Now it's all peace." Daniel looked at me and said softly, "Maybe because the woman who guards it learned how to turn storms into light." His words warmed me. He had finally understood what I'd been trying to teach him all along. By evening, Arthur stopped by carrying newspapers and a letter. "Beatrice, he said the city council wants you to speak at the Cultural Service Awards. They're honoring citizens who've contributed to the community." I blinked in surprise. Me, I haven't done anything grand. Arthur chuckled. "You didn't just save a house, you saved a story. You reminded people that heritage isn't meant to be displayed. It's meant to be lived." I fell quiet, then nodded. Perhaps it was time to speak not just for myself, but for every woman who had been broken by the people she loved most. That night, I sat at my desk with the old fountain pen Harold gave me when he became an ambassador. I opened my notebook and began to write. I once thought justice meant punishment. But true justice is when you keep your kindness even among those who tried to take it from you. Moonlight spilled over the desk, turning everything silver. In that light, I could almost see Harold smiling. The ceremony took place in the city hall. The small auditorium fell silent as I stepped to the podium. Daniel sat in the front row beside Rosa and Arthur, his eyes bright with pride. I began, "I am not a hero, and this is not a story of miracles. It's a story of a mother, a wife, a woman, who once lost her home to betrayal and who chose to rise again. Not to seek revenge, but to protect the dignity of kindness." I paused, voice trembling. All of us will face betrayal at some point. But please don't let bitterness define you. As long as you hold on to goodness, this world still has hope. The hall went still. Then the applause came soft at first, then growing warm and unending. I looked down and saw Daniel wiping his tears. In that moment, I knew my story no longer belonged to me alone. Afterward, many women came to shake my hand. They spoke of their own pain of sons, husbands, and families who had wounded them. They said my story made them want to rise again. I didn't say much. I just held their hands. Some wounds don't need words, only recognition. When we returned home, it was dark. Daniel helped me out of the car, his voice thick. "Mom, I've never been prouder. I promise I'll keep doing what's right." I smiled. "Do it for yourself, Daniel. Justice doesn't need repayment, only continuation." Inside, I turned on the lights. The walls, the photos, the worn corners, everything looked beautiful again. Every scar in this house told a story worth keeping. I walked to the fireplace, touched the silver urn, and lit a small candle. Harold's photo glowed beside it. "Harold," I whispered, "everything's calm now. Do you hear me? Everything's calm." Outside, wind brushed through the violet garden, carrying their sweet scent. I sat down with a cup of tea and watched the moonlight shimmer across the grass. "I don't need justice from others anymore," I murmured. "I've found it within myself." If you've ever walked through loss, believe this peace doesn't come from escaping the past. It comes when you're brave enough to smile at it. And if you've stayed with me until now, let me say one thing: live kindly. Because kindness, sooner or later, always finds its way back to you. Thank you for walking with me to the very end of this story. And so the story of Mrs. Beatrice Langford comes to a close, not with tears nor resentment, but with the gentle light of compassion and rebirth. From a mother betrayed by her son and nearly stripped of her home by greed, she rose again with wisdom, resolve, and forgiveness to reclaim not just her house, but her dignity and peace. The Langford house, once filled with pain and betrayal, has become a symbol of forgiveness, of justice carried out through humanity. She didn't need to defeat anyone. She only needed to overcome her own fear. And when she did, every wound found its way to healing. Mrs. Beatrice's journey reminds us that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. That justice does not live only in courtrooms, but in every heart that chooses what is right, even when the world falters. If you've ever been hurt, betrayed, or believed you couldn't rise again, remember the dawn always follows the darkest night. And maybe, just maybe, today's story will be the small flame that warms your heart again. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it so more people can feel the strength and grace within this journey. See you in the next story, where lessons of family justice and kindness will continue to be told straight from the heart